Today's story in Great Stories in Bioethics, my personal YouTube channel, is a personal story about my battles with acne and skin and a famous doctor who helped me. It's also about the blurry line between medical therapy and enhancement, and it's directed especially at young people who have systemic acne like I had, and maybe the story can help them a little. So I got my first pimple at age 13, had an acne scar at the time, and I was told that I would grow out of it and the scars would fade, but the opposite was true. Pimples got worse, the scars got deeper and cratered. And of course, not all acne scars, but I had the scar in kind. My parents, like many parents of the greatest generation, thought it was no big deal to have teenage acne, that I would grow out of it and get over it. But 65 years later, I still get the occasional pimple and I still worry about scars. In the early 1950s, early 1960s, there were all kinds of theories about why you got pimples. I was told to stop eating chocolate, even though I never ate chocolate. I was told, you're masturbating too much. I was told that you should get more sunlight and blah, blah, blah. Nothing worked. And some things made it worse. The year I joined the wrestling team and had my face pushed into a sweaty mat was horrible. So like most teenagers, I bought Clearasil, I bought Stridus, alcohol wipes, the things that were advertised on American Bandstand. Nothing helped. I sometimes see young girls today wearing a kind of makeup and Clearasil, which I think actually makes your acne worse. But fortunately, my family had good medical coverage through group health. My father worked for the federal government, and this was our medical plan, and it covered visits to a dermatologist. So I would frequently go down, get my family car and drive down to the group health building in DC and see a dermatologist once a month, where he would take a blackhead extractor, comedones they were called, a block up follicle, and punch them. And he would also expose me to ultralight therapy, UV light. Eventually, he encouraged me to buy one and put the goggles on. It was give myself that burn look at home. It didn't really help. And the picture in my high school yearbooks, of course, they were always airbrushed. The scars and the pimples were airbrushed out. So I looked completely different in those pictures than I really looked. I also worked as a lifeguard my senior year, thinking that this would help. And it did, the tan did sort of cover up some of the scars and acne, but of course, it also made the sebaceous glands even more active, didn't really help. So by the time of my senior year, I had a lot of scars. My face actually looked kind of on the sides over here, looked kind of like the moon crater. And at the time, sometimes my best friend Gordon would accompany my father on a Saturday morning down to the Library of Congress, where my father liked to go and read books on Saturday morning. He worked downtown as a trademark examiner and knew about the Library of Congress. And one day, Gordon discovered an article in the Archives of Dermatology about a man named Norman Ehrenreich, a pioneering dermatologist in Manhattan, who had developed a technique for getting rid of acne scars, and it was called dermabrasion. I later learned that Ehrenreich had really kind of pioneered dermabrasion techniques in the early 50s and 60s. When he saw me later, he did the typical thing where he sprayed ethyl chloride on my face, which kind of stung. And then he took a drill with a wire brush on the end, kind of abraded the upper surfaces of my skin. And the idea and his great insight was that skin can naturally rejuvenate, and it rejuvenates to, after healing, to smoother, almost baby-like skin. So I had saved my money working as a busboy and as a waiter in various restaurants, and my mother thought that I should be able to do what I want with my saved money. My father was a little less enthusiastic. He had spent a year in medical school before he switched to law school, and he wasn't so enthusiastic, but eventually he went along with it. One day they drove me up to Ehrenreich's clinic on Fifth Avenue in New York. Ehrenreich told me and my parents that he thought he could help me. I think he saw that my family had modest means and I was paying with my own money, so he gave me a very good price. So one day in May, my parents drove me up to Manhattan, and I sat kind of sat back in a dental chair, and I felt the sting of the epichloride, and I saw my upper levers of my skin and blood kind of scrape off onto his kind of plastic schmuck. And it was quite an experience. They put me in bandages. They had me in a recovery room for a while. And then I went into the back seat of my parents' car, probably because I also had some benzodiazepines in me, and slept all the way back home to Washington, D.C. And then later, bandages were taken off and a very big scab formed. Here's a picture of me about a couple of days later playing around with my sister in the backyard, my little sister Carolyn, trying to scare her. And you can see the big scab on my face. This was also the first time I'd ever taken antibiotics for acne. I started that on tetracycline because Orntrike, of course, didn't want zits to form during the healing process. Later, he switched me to doxycycline and then minocycline, new generation antibiotics. It also turned out that Orntrike had told me that this was a 2-operation process. So when I went off to college, when we were married, I came back over Christmas vacation. Again, my parents drove me up for a second operation. Fortunately, it was a long break. And by the time I got back to when we were married, my skin was mostly smooth. I did have one mishap in a year. I unfortunately joined a fraternity where I was taken on a joyride and jumped in a back road where the burlap bag kind of scraped all my new skin. And it really pissed me off about the fraternity, which I later dropped out of. They didn't really ever get the message about what I had been through. Anyway, I didn't realize at the time that Norman Orntrike was a really famous guy. He was the first president of the American Society for Dermatological Surgery, and he's most famous as the father of hair transplantation. He realized that the transplanted follicle retains the characteristics of its source, so that it's when planted in like a male scalp, it will regrow. He also created a lot of the techniques that famous skin companies use today based on sequential cleansing, exfoliation, and moisturizing. He was really a giant in the field, which I didn't really realize. So my skin fared well for decades, but by 1997, the acne was again active. I was again scarring. And at the time, after the cloning of Dolly, I had written a book, Who's Afraid of Cloning? And I started getting invited to give talks about cloning around the country. I knew that the rough guys, the bad guys in the movies always had the bad acne scars, the ice pick scars. You know, you think Ray Liotta or Rutger Hauer, early Tommy Lee Jones, Charles Bronson, James Wood, Edgar J. Olmos. And I didn't want to be Scarface out there defending human cloning. So I went to a local dermatologist in Birmingham, Gary Monheit, who used a slightly different technique, one that I think Orntrike had also pioneered, of using tiny skin plugs to plug the ice pick scars. The skin was taken from the back of my ears. So first and the deep craters were plugged. So that would heal for a couple months. And then Monheit planed my skin like a dermabrasion. And this time, instead of having scab form, I had used Vaseline, which was a much quicker result. And this had to be done twice to get rid of all the scars, but it worked really well. There is a downside of all these operations. Basically, the melanin in my skin got largely destroyed. And because I had been exposed to so much UV light as a teenager, and because I had been a lifeguard for 2 different summers, I'm at very high risk for skin cancer. So I have to use a very big sunblock. Despite all that, as you can see, I ended up with fairly good skin. And so for young people who are struggling with this, there is hope. I guess my message is don't be passive about cystic acne and scars. If your parents think you can't afford to see a dermatologist, try a university where medical dermatological residents often have a free clinic one afternoon. Some dermatologists offer free consults. At least find out what your options are. So was this medical therapy or enhancement? I always thought of cystic acne as a disease, and certainly some medical insurance companies thought of it that way. The dermabrasions for the scars were commonly thought of as enhancements. I'm even a little wobbly about that, but you can see how the line blurs, because what was, to me, medical therapy, a lot did become in my old age a kind of enhancement. I'm a little annoyed sometimes when I see young college students in my classes whose are suffering through bad cystic acne and their parents won't support them in getting treatment, it's not really necessary to suffer through this. And dermatologists today have so many more tools to treat cystic acne than when I was growing up. So if you're watching this with cystic acne, don't be passive about it. There are things you can do. You can change and control things. I do. That's it for today. Hope to see you again next Tuesday.